Regardless of your opinion on government surveillance, we'll see what encryption backdoors are and how they're made. And we'll learn how to uncover a backdoor. And an ultramarathon is a race longer than 26.2 miles, which is 42 and a bit kilometers. This section could just be called running, so we'll learn how to run our first 5, 10, half marathon or ultramarathon. And our presenter, Porter, is a software engineer in Washington, D.C. So you ready to present, Porter?
Yes. Can everyone hear me?
Awesome. I do, in fact, hear you, and pretty sure everyone else can at this point. So without any further ado, Porter Adams with encryption backdoors and ultramarathon running.
Great, thank you. So let's get started. A summary of the talk, like you said, or like all of this conferences, this is an introductory talk, so I'm going to keep it with as little background knowledge as possible. Encryption backdoors can involve a lot of math, but I will try to keep it at a level where everyone can understand. But because questions can get quite technical, just message me on Twitter, and we're not going to have a Q&A in the first half. And then in the second half, we'll talk about running, how to run your first 5K, 10K, or however far you want to go race. And then I'm sure there'll be some good questions at the end of that. So let's start with what is encryption. So encryption is basically the way that secret messages are made. So if you want to send a message and you don't want other people to read it, then you can use encryption to go between the plain text, which is what your actual message is, and then you can send a ciphertext over the network, like in the mail, like over the internet. And this way, anyone like who intercepts that won't be able to read it. And then on the receiving end, they can decrypt back to the plain text. So in this case, I took PancakesCon and encrypted it to Imix, because I can't even say that. And that's kind of the point, is that looking at the ciphertext, you have no idea what the plain text should have been. So a really old, simple example of encryption is called the Caesar cipher. And basically, you take any plain text letter and you move it backwards 3 spaces in the alphabet. So here we see E is moving backwards to B, A was moved backwards to X, and so that's how you get from the plain text to a ciphertext. And then to decrypt from the ciphertext, you just move right back up. So it works the same way forwards and backwards, but it looks pretty weird. And actually, the last example I showed you, this was an example of a Caesar cipher. And so PancakesCon turns into that. You can see the A, the second letter, moves to X, the second letter, just like in this example. So there are 2 big categories of encryption. There's symmetric key and then asymmetric, which I will call public key cryptography. Starting with symmetric, it's used most of the time to actually encrypt the real message. And encryption and decryption use the same key. So Caesar cipher, like you just saw, is an example of symmetric key cryptography. Cryptography is just the word for the study of all of this. So I'll kind of use it interchangeably a little bit. So let's look at another example of symmetric key encryption. If we want to take the message hi and send it across a computer, one really good way to do this is to use what's called a OneTime Pad. And so I'm going to explain all the numbers on the screen. First, computers don't store characters as HI, they store it as 0s and 1s. So just convert from ASCII characters into binary. And so this binary is what you see as the plain text. That is the binary for hi in ASCII. And then if you take this key, which is our encryption and decryption key, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and so on, there's an operation you can do. It's basically just adding each of these columns together. It's called XOR. It's adding without carrying. It's one way to think about it. But more or less, you just mash the plain text and the key together, and you get the ciphertext. And then to get back from the ciphertext, you just mash the ciphertext with the key again, and you get back to the plain text. So here, when we take hi and we mash it with this key, we get a closed bracket and the letter E, which doesn't look anything like the hi that we originally sent. And then decryption works the same way backwards. Public key encryption is really cool. If you've ever seen this before, I love it. Also, yes, those are pictures of my dogs. It's the same dog. So the problem here, the problem with symmetric key cryptography is it uses a key to encrypt and decrypt, which means that in this scenario here, let me explain the characters. We have Alice on the left, who's trying to send a message to Bob on the right. But we have Eve down at the bottom who's listening in. Eve is an eavesdropper. You know, it's very clever. So if Alice wanted to send a message to Bob using the symmetric key algorithm we just saw, the OneTime Pad, the problem is Alice and Bob, if they haven't talked to each other before, they don't have a key to use for symmetric key cryptography yet. And if Alice tries to send Bob a key, then Eve is going to listen in, and Eve is going to hear the key, the secret key, and so Eve will be able to decrypt anything that's encrypted with the secret key if it's sent in the first place. So it kind of seems impossible if you first start thinking about it, if Alice and Bob are on like totally different sides of the world or the internet, that they could ever establish a secret that Eve would not be able to figure out. But there's a very cool idea from Diffie and Hellman in 1976, which is basically to separate the key into two pieces, which is commonly referred to as the public key and the private key. I will keep calling the private key just the key, and I will call the public key the lock, because I think it makes a lot more intuitive sense for beginners to imagine a lock and a key. So the basic idea here is Bob can tell the whole world how to make a lock that only Bob knows the key to. And so Bob can tell everyone Bob's lock, and then Alice can use Bob's lock to encrypt a message with it and send it back to Bob. Now Eve listening in at the bottom will know how to make Bob's lock, and we'll see something encrypted with Bob's lock, but without Bob's key, neither of those things is super helpful. And so Eve will not be able to read the message. So if you've never seen this before, this is super cool. This is how you can like access your bank online. You can put your credit card into websites and things, because this allows you to set up a secure connection between you and Amazon or your bank and everywhere else. And it's pretty simple, but it's kind of magical when you think about it. So let's get into the details of my talk. What is a backdoor, specifically an encryption backdoor? Basically, it's a master key or a skeleton key, and it can open any of the locks and read any of the messages. So if Alice has her own lock and key, Bob has his own lock and key, Carol has her lock and key, a backdoor would be able to open any of the messages sent to Alice, Bob, or Carol, regardless of which lock and key they use. So let's do a little bit of history lesson. In 1993, the NSA designed a phone chip called the Clipper chip, and it was meant to be an encryption device for phones everywhere, but it came with a built-in backdoor, which basically when they created these chips, the chips have the private key on them, and it would send a copy of that private key, the company making the chips send a copy of the private key to the government. And so the government would just have a giant database of everyone's private keys so that they could read or any of your text messages or listen to any of your phone calls if they wanted. And this poster on the right was created by RSA company. They did a lot of the public pushback against the Clipper chip, and it ended up like not being used very much. The crypto wars were the whole, like, there's a whole series of debates in the 90s about like the uses of encryption, and that could be a whole talk in itself, but that's not what my talk's about. So secrets are no fun for governments. Governments love being able to read everyone's messages, especially other governments' messages. So if you think about it, even if a government knew how to make safe encryption, would you tell like your enemies how to keep secrets from you? And the answer is certainly not, as we'll see in our next slide. There is a company called Crypto AG, is a Swiss company, I'll say Swiss in quotes for now, that sold crypto machines to over 120 countries from 1970 to 2018. And in 1995, Hans Buehler was arrested by the government of Iran because they suspected that he was leaking. These crypto machines are supposed to keep all of your messages safe, and Iran was pretty suspicious that Hans Buehler was leaking the message keys or intelligence somehow to the CIA and the NSA. Hans Buehler was the salesman. He was the top salesman, actually. So apparently he's pretty good at it because he sold these machines to 120 other countries. But after 9 months of interrogation, it's pretty clear that he didn't know anything about connections with the CIA or the NSA. But they were right to be suspicious because it was revealed just last month that this company has been owned the whole time by the CIA and the BND, and BND is the German equivalent of it. So basically, the entire rest of the world had been counting on the CIA and the BND to keep messages safe, which they were not doing. They were selling backdoored machines. So let's look at how you would actually create one of these encryption backdoors. The idea is generally to insert a hidden mathematical weakness in it so that anyone else, if you don't know the weakness, it's pretty tough to decrypt the message. But if you do know the weakness, then you have your secret backdoor. And there are two good places to hide your secret weakness. The first is to rig the key generation algorithm, which is the algorithm used to create the keys in the first place. So if you know what the keys are going to be ahead of time, then the rest of the encryption doesn't matter because you just have the keys and you're good to go. The second way that we could create a backdoor is to rig the encryption algorithm to not really depend on the keys too much. And I'll explain that more in our second example. But first example, we're going to look at rigging sort of before the key generation algorithm. So the dual EC DRBG, I hate acronyms, but there's one for you, is a 2006 standard published by NIST, which is a pseudorandom number generator. Lots of cryptography and encryption depends on random numbers or numbers that look pretty random. And this particular algorithm generates random numbers using structures called elliptic curves. And you can see one on the right, it's the curvy thing. And importantly, basically moving around elliptic curves, you can think of it as just bouncing around between points. So if we start with a point P and a point Q, we can, through some cool math, consider or call it adding points P and Q together in this weird way. And the way you do that on elliptic curves is you draw a line through P and Q, hits the curve at another point up at the top, and then you reflect it over the x-axis. And the exact reasoning for that doesn't really matter for this talk. Basically, you can just think of it as you take points P and Q and you can bing them around and you get out something that's pretty random. Importantly though, we're trying to generate a pseudorandom number, and from bouncing around between these elliptic curves, we're going to get a point. And so the way we get a random number from the point is we just look at the x coordinate. We don't want the whole x coordinate because maybe the exact point's not totally random. So what they do is they just chop off the first 18 bits of the x coordinate, and there's your random numbers. So they're kind of two halves. The first half is bouncing around points. The second half is chopping off a little bit, chopping off the first couple bits. So the next slide's going to look scary, but I think you're going to be able to understand it once I explain it. So first, let's look at state update and bit generation. Those are the two halves I was just talking about. The state update is the bouncing around, and the bit generation is the truncating the 16 bits off the x coordinate. So if we look at that green arrow down at the bottom on the right half, we're going to look at the right half of this diagram first. By the way, this whole diagram is from a presentation at Crypto 2007, basically explaining how all of this could be used for a backdoor. And I'm taking their 1 hour presentation and explaining it in 3 minutes. But the right half, we are truncating 16 bits off the x coordinate. The thing to remember though is a lot of these numbers for encryption are really big. So typically like hundreds of bits long. So removing 16 bits from like a 500-bit number isn't hiding very much of it, and it's pretty easy to undo those and figure out like what the real point was, because it has to be on the actual elliptic curve. So the green arrow is pretty easy for anyone to undo. And that's not necessarily a problem by itself. That's not completely a backdoor. We can't undo everything unless you can also undo this red arrow. So this red arrow, there are a lot of symbols in here, but really all I want you to look at is the P and the Q. And remember when we're on the elliptic curve, you start with the P and the Q are your two kind of like base points, and then you bounce around a bunch of times. But if you pick those P and Q carefully, like they affect like everything else. And so the suspicion here is that the NSA carefully selected this P and Q to be related in a way that they can undo this whole algorithm. Right, so that's it. Let's move on to our second way of creating an encryption backdoor, because that was rigging pseudorandom numbers. So if they can predict, if you think you have random numbers, but they actually know exactly what you're going to have, they can find your key that way. The second way I want to show you is creating an encryption algorithm that doesn't depend on the key very much. So we'll make actually an AES-like encryption system with backdoor. AES is the advanced encryption standard. It's used today. I personally don't think it has a backdoor in it, but you could design something that's very similar looking that does have a backdoor. So the idea here is called preserving linear partitions. Preserving, just keeping together. Partitions just means splitting it up. So in this example I have for you, I've simplified this a lot, but if you imagine moving from like these plain text dots, and each one of these dots is sent to some sort of dot over on the right in the ciphertext. Ideally, this should be random, and so all these dots in the plain text should look pretty spread out in the ciphertext. But if you notice in the plain text, there's 5 dots that are clumped together in the top left, and then there's still 5 dots clumped together in the top right in the ciphertext. And the 1 dots stay like each of the quadrants. It moves around a little bit, but the quadrants stay separated. And the point of designing and something like this is if I look at one of these points in the ciphertext, I kind of know like what area like it came from in the plain text, just based on where it ended up. If I know like these which quadrant goes to which quadrant. So because of this, if I see some random point in a ciphertext, I have a pretty good guess already at where it is in the plain text, and I don't need to check every plain text possibility. I only need to check like the plain text possibilities in that 1 quadrant. So what this means is regardless of what key you picked, the key is how it's actually going to move around kind of within the quadrant, you're still stuck there regardless of the key. So this is what I meant when I said like the encryption algorithm doesn't depend on the key very much. Is you're allowed to use whatever key you want here, but you're going to be stuck kind of in the same area. Now in the actual paper, this whole concept's like it's a little more hidden than this. It's not as obvious as quadrants. That's the idea. So we made it. 20 minutes. We covered everything from introduction to encryption all the way up to government backdoors and what's possible to maybe backdoor today. Questions can get quite technical, so remember, just ask me those on Twitter. And I hope you learned something. Because now we're going to jump into the second half of the talk, which is running. Now, if you know me, I wouldn't call myself a runner. I don't love running every day. I certainly don't run every day. And my point in this talk is to hopefully motivate you and show you that you can run like a lot farther than you think you can. And you don't have to be like some crazy person who wakes up at 5 a.m. to go run like 8 miles before work to get it done. So first question is, how far do you want to go? You probably have an idea in your head of roughly where you're at. 5K is about 3 miles, up to 10K, up to half, up to marathon, up to ultra. And if you've completed one of those, start thinking about the next step up the ladder. I'd say it's like pretty reasonable, like 5-step ladder, and you can make it up to the next step from wherever you are in about 2 to 3 months if you want. But generally, preparation's kind of all the same. You just have to scale whatever you're doing, the distance to be what you want. This is a picture on the right of Maggie Guttural. She won the 2019 Big's Backyard Ultra, which is an ultra race where every hour you have to run 4 miles. And if you don't complete 4 miles before the hour's over, then you have to drop out. And so this race just goes on and on and on. And so she won by running over 250 miles over 60 hours in a row. So if you have any idea about like what's humanly possible as like how far a human could run, like 250 miles is the limit, and I don't think any of us are coming close to it. So I think we're all going to be okay running like even just a marathon. 26 miles doesn't sound so bad when you look at what some of like the really advanced people are doing. So the first thing to do, I guess, is to kind of benchmark and see where you're at right now, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. If none of you know David Goggins, he is an amazing guy, and I would highly recommend reading his book, Can't Hurt Me. But basically, the first day he decided he wanted to go out and do all of these things, he ran about 400 yards from like his driveway to the end of the street, and was too tired and like had to go back home. And 3 months later, and like a hell of a training cycle later, he began like he tried out to be a Navy SEAL, and after a couple attempts, like he was successful. So he went from being like able to run only about 400 yards to being one of the most fit people on the planet. So if you ever need some like motivation, especially on like mindset and believing in yourself, please read like Can't Hurt Me or anything about David Goggins. So for your first race, I say step 1, put it on the calendar, but right now a lot of races are canceled, like most events are. I guess that's why we're here at PancakesCon. But still, I do recommend, even if you can't do an official race, just say like on this date, I am going to run 5 miles. If this is your first time doing any of these things, you don't have to run the whole time. Like, please walk like as much as you want. I'm gonna talk about this more, but even now, like when I'm running marathons or ultras, the farthest I could go straight is about 5 miles, and then I need to take like a water break or walk for a little bit, and then I can get back up and keep going after like some walking. But you don't have to be able to run 26 miles in a row, okay? So when you're training, honestly, just Google search for couch to 5K or couch to 10K, couch to marathon. I tend to like those plans because even though I don't sit on my couch too much, like those training plans really do take you from 0 to wherever you want to be at. And most of them only last 4 to 8 weeks. If you wanted to be really prepared, there's 12-week ones. But what I find with the 12-week ones is you kind of lose some motivation. So I recommend finding about an 8-week plan at the most. Also, what this means is your goal should be to run whatever your next distance you want to be in about 4 to 8 weeks. Really the only mistake you can make is injuries. Do not get injured at any point during this. Running is not like super intensive. It's just long and it's just a lot. But you know your own body best, and you can probably tell if things aren't quite going right. Just stop before you really get injured and go take care of it, go rest. There's none of these things that like you couldn't do like in another month if you need to like take some time off to take care of yourself. Really, that's the only thing that can go wrong here is an injury. The next step, find your pace. So in case you didn't check the news in October, Elliot Kipchoge ran the world's first sub 2-hour marathon on October 12th, 2019. That's crazy fast. Like if you like, but like I said earlier, when I run all of these races, the first time you're doing any of these, do not even think about what your time is. Your only goal when you're doing a race for the first time, like a certain distance for the first time, is to complete that race. Then if you want to go back and sign up for a second or a third one and you want to start improving your time, then go worry about it. But the first time you're doing it, just sign up. You're probably going to walk some of it. That's totally fine. It might take you a little while. Your goal is just to get to the finish line. And then in like several years of training, if you want to try and go a sub 2-hour marathon, that's your decision. So preparing for race day, you don't need to do anything special until 1 to 2 hours before the race, or 1 to 2 days before the race, excuse me. In terms of like diet, food, really like just be healthy. I mean, drinking more water always helps stay hydrated. I like eating pasta the night before. Fruit for breakfast the day of is usually a good choice. Don't eat nothing. Eating nothing is a mistake. There was one race, I ran Orange County half marathon where I did not have breakfast beforehand, and it was not very fun. At least the first couple miles until the rest station, which I will talk about in a second. On this slide. So rest stations are glorious. I wish someone had told me about these before I ran like any of my races, because they're just these places, like stations along the way, usually every mile or every 2 miles. And they just have water, Gatorade, there's usually food, there's usually bananas and snacks. And so it's literally just like when you're running and you're sweaty and you're tired and you've gone like a mile and then one of these stations shows up, it's just a blessing. And it's just like, it's gonna be okay. I have water and food. I take a quick break and then you'll be good to go again. I didn't really like, no one told me about these things beforehand, but it's honestly one of the best parts of running in official races. The other good part is that besides these official rest stations, usually when you're running, if you're like through a neighborhood or in a city, there will be lots of people cheering for you just at their houses, out on the sidewalks. So I'll never forget, there was one marathon I was running where I think this was the Orange County half again. There was this little kid, there's a family, and probably like a 6-year-old had some, I don't remember, it was like a peanut butter snack. Basically, he was standing in his yard with some food, like for the runners to come by and grab. And so I was hungry because remember, I didn't eat breakfast before this race. So I came by to like grab a snack and he pulled it away, like the tray from me. I was like, what's happening? And he's like, you can't take this snack unless you promise me you'll cross the finish line. And this little 5-year-old just like looked me dead in the eyes and he wasn't going to give me a snack unless I promised him I'd cross the finish line. I was like, oh my gosh, well, I really want the snack, so I guess I'm going to finish this race. I think he knew that I was having a tough day. But so yeah, I took the snack, 5-year-old, complete the race, and like thinking about that the whole time, I was like, well, I can't quit now because I promised that little 5-year-old kid that I'll cross the finish line. That's another, highly recommend telling your friends that you're going to do one of these things. Sign up, tell your friends, because you'll be thinking about that if you're like, let's say you're running a half marathon and you're about mile 10, you still got 3 more miles to run. Thinking about your friends and remembering that you told them that you would finish this thing, that's a pretty powerful motivator, because you don't want to give up because you're like, well, I did tell everyone that I was going to finish this. It'd be kind of sad if I had to go back and let them down, because you don't, like, it's easier to kind of like let yourself down a little bit, I think, than it is to let your friends down. And so telling friends, talking to friends about it is a huge motivator. You can even run races with friends, which is really fun. So race day, when you're actually running and trying to complete the race, biggest rule I have is don't think about how far the finish line is. The farthest I think about in advance is like where the next rest station is, because I'm highly motivated by snacks. But it's just like imagining running like even just like, I don't know, 5 miles straight sounds terrible. And that's a really far distance. Like 5 miles is pretty far on a car, and you're trying to do it on your feet. So really all you should be thinking about is, okay, 5 miles, that's really far, but can I go 1 more mile right now? Like, can I get to the next race station? And just like break it up into chunks. And just as long as you can keep going 1 more mile, you're gonna look up, and soon enough you'll be like at the finish line. Other things, like when you're trying to decide like how far you really need to run before these races, I tend to, my rule of thumb is I need to have run about half of the race distance during training. So when you look at these like training schedules, none of them, like if you're training for a marathon, you don't have to run 26 miles before you run a marathon. In fact, oftentimes the longest run you do before a marathon is only about 20 miles. So that extra 6 miles of boost really just comes from being hype on race day and being excited that you're there and running with all the other people and having people cheer you on. And it's kind of amazing, but you don't need to have trained all the way up to a 26-mile race before doing a 26-mile race. I train about halfway. So if I can run about a 13-mile race without too much trouble, then I'm ready for the marathon. And if you can run like a 5K without too much trouble, you're ready for a 10K. So that's my rule of thumb, is if you can complete half of it, you can complete the whole thing. And the last step is celebrate when you're finished and you're all done. It's exciting. It's a huge accomplishment. It feels great. Usually when you cross the finish line, they have more snacks, more treats, and like goodie bags and things to give you. There's a photo of me running. Thank you, Amberly Bogus, for helping with me with the slides. It's a great picture of Amberly, not as great a picture of me, but it's fine. And thank you, PancakesCon, for having me. I hope I did okay on time here.
Oh yeah,
I've got time.
Oh yeah, you've got like 10 minutes or so still.
All right.
There are a couple of questions that have showed up. This one person asks, so how do I keep myself occupied during a long run? Do you have any tips?
Yes, so how do you keep yourself occupied? Some people love and just swear by listening to music the whole time. Put together like a giant music playlist of all your favorite songs. And I know a lot of people who like listen to podcasts or just listen to their favorite playlist. Personally, I enjoy the time kind of in my own head, and I like using that time spent running to just kind of think about like really whatever comes into my head. Sometimes about friends, wherever else I'm going on in life, like maybe it's about dinner, the food that's coming next. It is a long time just in your own head, and especially this is one thing for all the treadmill runners. I think it's actually harder if you're on a treadmill because the scenery's not changing. You're not seeing anything new. If you do run outside, one, it's like it's way better on your knees and things. it's better to like avoid injuries. But two, you get to like go see the sites and like explore around, and you can go visit like neighborhoods nearby or find like actual running trails. So this picture is actually like halfway up a mountain. My friend and I went, and like we ran just to find this waterfall, but all along the way there were really cool sights. And so mostly I was just thinking about like, wow, like look at these trees, look at nature. Like, so it's kind of up to you on how you want to spend the time in your own head, or if you don't like spending time in your own head by yourself, then I recommend listening to music or podcasts.
Fantastic. All right, and another participant asks, is there any cross-training that you recommend during training besides running?
Yes, so cross-training is great because I personally, I should have covered this actually. Thank you for this question. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, don't love running every day. It's just not my favorite thing to do. I played soccer growing up, so if you put a soccer ball in front of me, I'm a lot happier. But cross training, really, I would just say like look at find your pace. We're gonna a couple steps here. Find your pace for how fast you can run about a mile, and then like multiply that and add a little bit of time to find like approximately how long you plan to spend running this race. And that's like the time that's going to take to complete the race. That's what you should be thinking about for cross training. So when I ran my first marathon, it took me about 5 hours, which means that I had to be prepared with cross training to do something for 5 hours. So I really don't think it matters if you do a dance class for 5 hours, if you go on a bicycle for 5 hours, if you want to join a gym or swim or any other kind of like intense like cardio training. Whatever you do, just think about how like the amount of time, and you can build a whole training schedule just off of dance classes if you want.
So it's the duration that matters more than anything else.
Yes, yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, I don't see any other questions at this time, so I think you're all set. Thank you very much for coming on and presenting with PancakesCon.
Yay, thank you everyone.
So we'll just be doing a quick switch over here. I'll bounce the recording and I'll have your next presenter on in just a couple of minutes. Meantime, stay tuned to PancakesCon Track 2. All right, and just bear with us a minute while we get set up properly, and we'll start the next talk momentarily.